Welcome everybody. Before I do the reading for today, which is chapter 12 of the Bible story by William Neal, can I just take this opportunity to say a big thank you to all those who've sent messages saying how much they'd appreciated these readings. I've even got about 4 people who've managed to get hold of a copy of the book on the internet, so well done. Well done. I wasn't sure how easy it would be to find a copy, but glad I've inspired you. It makes it all feel worthwhile. So chapter 12 is called Solomon the Magnificent. There are 2 verdicts on Solomon in the Bible. One comes from the narrator of his story in the Old Testament. King Solomon exceeded all the kings of the earth for riches and for wisdom. The other came from Jesus, when he said that Solomon in all his regalia was less impressive than a wayside flower. On the evidence, Jesus was perhaps the shrewder judge. Solomon was certainly astute. He transformed David's rustic kingdom into a centre of spectacularly successful commercial enterprise, with a flourishing industry and a thriving foreign trade. As a tycoon, he was brilliant, but as a king of Israel, he was a disaster. In the eyes of later historians, his greatest achievement was the building of the temple in Jerusalem. For this, they were prepared to overlook his glaring failure as a man and to credit him with a wisdom which he certainly did not possess. The one example of his so-called wisdom, in inverted commas, which is quoted, shows him to have a typical Oriental quick-wittedness in unravelling knotty problems, but little more than that. When 2 wrangling women claimed the same child as their own, he offered to cut the infant in 2, giving a half to each, knowing that the real mother would rather surrender the child to her rival than see it killed. On his father's David's death, he'd reached the throne by a palace intrigue. He then proceeded to assassinate any other potential claimants, including his older brother, and settled down to a reign of peace and prosperity. Peaceful it certainly was. There is no record of any military expeditions whatever, and no record of any threats to the safety of the realm. Solomon was not a soldier like his father. He had apparently no ambition to extend the frontiers of his kingdom. His policy was to be one of consolidation and commercial expansion. He safeguarded himself by alliances with foreign states, sometimes by marriage, by strengthening his border fortresses and by increasing his standing army. But above all, his ambition was to rebuild his capital, Jerusalem. In David's time, the Ark of the Covenant had been housed in a tent as a symbol of the old nomadic life. Now it must be installed in a temple. The arrangements for the construction of this temple, with its furnishings and its specifications, occupy a wholly disproportionate amount of space in the Old Testament. To later generations who included these details, it was the most noteworthy single achievement to Solomon's credit. Yet, when all is said and done, the tabernacle which he built to house the ark was a comparatively small building, less than 100 feet long and 50 feet high. It was considerably smaller than Solomon's elaborate palace, to which it was attached as a kind of royal chapel. Nevertheless, the great temple enclosure, which contained palace, tabernacle, and other buildings, must have impressed people who were still not far distant from the time when Saul had had to fight for every inch of Israelite soil. Some of the stone came from a quarry just under the temple itself. But the expensive cedar wood, cypress, gold and bronze for the furnishings and the decorations had to be brought from a distance and paid for. Phoenician workmen had to be employed since the Israelites were unskilled in this kind of work. They too had to be paid. So in addition to Solomon's normal expenditure on his household staff, which was considerable, and on his army, which was a large one, he had to find money for these lavish building projects too. Part of the cost was made by taxation, which is always unpopular. Part was avoided by forced labour, which is even more unpopular. The old tribal areas were divided up into districts, which were made responsible in turn for maintaining the king's household. Overseers were appointed, and a chief labour organiser was put in charge of the whole scheme. Taxation and forced labour did not produce enough to meet the king's ambitious plans. So he levied heavy tolls on caravans using the great trade route between Asia and Africa, which passed through his territory. He became a trader in horses, buying from Egypt and selling in Syria. He sold part of his land to the Phoenicians for gold, and it looks as if he even sold some of his subjects to Egypt in exchange for horses and chariots, which he then retailed. But his masterstroke was the exploitation of his iron and copper mines. It's only recently that archaeologists have discovered the chief source of Solomon's income. At the top of the Red Sea, remains of mines and blast furnaces were found, indicating, in the words of Nelson Gluck, who conducted the excavations, that Solomon had built the seaport of Ezion-Geber and turned it into the Pittsburgh of Palestine, a remarkable industrial site with copper refineries and shipbuilding, from which he exported the products of his factories. Solomon's merchant navy sailed from there to Ophir, probably Somaliland, trading his wares for gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks. Since the Hebrews were no sailors, the ships were manned by Phoenicians. When the Queen of Sheba, from the land of spice in South Arabia, paid her notorious visit to Solomon to prove him with hard questions, it was no doubt more of a trade mission than a state occasion, and these two astute Oriental rulers did some hard bargaining to their mutual economic advantage. The effects of this dramatic expansion of Israel in so short a time were, however, disastrous. No one would have complained if all this activity and enterprise had been for the good of the people as a whole. But it was, on the contrary, serving merely to gratify Solomon's love of ostentation and to support an ever-increasing entourage. David left a kingdom contented, united and solvent. Solomon's extravagance not only reduced it to near bankruptcy, but cut at the very roots of the relationship between king and people which David had established, and on which the unity of the kingdom depended. The Hebrews had too much of the nomadic spirit of independence still left in them to suffer gladly an autocrat such as Solomon. When that autocracy was combined with a policy that imposed hardships on them, for no other purpose than to satisfy the luxurious whims of the monarch and his courtiers, the justification for monarchy as such had in the people's eyes disappeared. In the later years of Solomon's reign, revolts among subject nations that David had bequeathed to him lost him both useful territory and even more useful income. The Copper King was either unwilling or unable to recover them. He was able to quell a revolt among his own people, but the storm broke after his death. The kingdom split in two. 10 of the tribes refused to recognize Solomon's son as king, and he was left with a fraction of the legacy which his father had inherited. The unwisdom of this legendary wisest of all the kings of the earth had brought its own retribution. It may be that Solomon had always had things too easy. He knew nothing of the hardships and the struggles that had kept his father David essentially a humble man, and always a people's man. In the royal court, when David was in his dotage, Solomon had been brought up by a fond mother who engineered his accession to the throne. His magnificence was paid for by the sweat of his people, for whom he showed contempt. His harem was enormous, though some of his marriages were political. Even the benevolent recorder of his story, who can see little fault in Solomon's behaviour, is forced to admit that his foreign wives may have been his undoing, and that he was not the man his father had been. He seems to have dabbled in natural science and lyric poetry, and may have coined some of the proverbs that are traditionally attributed to him. But he was certainly not the author of all the wisdom literature in the Old Testament, which was traditionally associated with his name. It was anything but wisdom that led him to alienate the affection and loyalty of his people, and to bring about the destruction of the unity which had been so painfully achieved. No one, however successful as a tycoon, could more woefully have misinterpreted the character of the Hebrews than to try to set himself up as a typical little Oriental despot over men who had still in their blood the desert nomad's passion for freedom.